There's been more fighting in Somalia this week between the force of African peacekeepers and the Islamist militants known as Al-Shabaab. In one incident, 3 Syrian doctors in the country providing medical assistance were killed when a convoy they were travelling in was ambushed. The peacekeeping troops sent into Somalia by the African Union can claim some success. They've restored a degree of order to the capital, Mogadishu. They've also pushed Al-Shabaab out of the main towns it once controlled in southern and central parts of Somalia. The AU soldiers have even managed to deliver a Christmas surprise to our man Mark Doyle.
This is the story about how I mislaid my spectacles on a battlefield in central Somalia. But it's also about how I learnt something new to me, that many parts of Somalia are very beautiful. There are green, fertile plains, and there are soaring mountains. I got to see these parts of Somalia, and yes, I can see, without my reading glasses, through the bulletproof windows of an armoured personnel carrier. My journey was under the protection of African Union troops who are fighting a full-scale war against highly motivated radical Islamists of the Al-Qaeda-affiliated Al-Shabaab army. I call them an army because I think the usual description of them as insurgents or guerrillas is inadequate, because Al-Shabaab, which means roughly the youth, control more territory than any other Al-Qaeda-linked group anywhere in the world. They sometimes act like an army, using defensive World War I-style trenches, for example. They have tactics. They have mortars. This is no ragtag movement. I know because in the 2 weeks I spent with the African Union soldiers, they were attacked every single day by Al-Shabaab, who use roadside bombs, snipers, or coordinated military advances. One morning, for example, I saw the immediate aftermath of an attack on an African Union base. I touched the flattened grass in the carefully spaced-out firing positions the Al-Shabaab men had crouched down in just hours earlier. I bent down to the ground to count the empty bullet cartridges that had spewed out of their rifles. They were shiny and brand new. This is a war that involves over 17,000 African Union troops, including armoured battalions with enormous Soviet-era T-55 tanks, Marines off the coast, and drones in the sky. The soldiers from countries like Uganda and Sierra Leone are dug in behind earthwork ramparts in strings of fortified outposts. The foreign soldiers are there because the government and army of Somalia are too weak on their own to face Al-Shabaab. That's the war. But did you know that there are also orange groves in Somalia? That there are mango plantations, rivers, well-watered fields and bustling markets? I didn't. Not really, because I've never seen these things before, with or without my glasses. Journalists are not usually lucky enough, as I was, to spend 2 whole weeks driving around Somalia. But on this trip, I travelled for hundreds of miles through South and Central Somalia and saw some of the real life in between the fighting. I saw farms, rivers and canals. I saw vast herds of camels and goats. There are forests, fruit trees and quarries. This war is partly about Islamist ideology, but it's also about winning control of these very real assets and sometimes very beautiful fertile countryside. But back to my glasses. I mentioned that I'd lost them to an officer from the Ugandan army who was accompanying me, more to make conversation really than out of any hope of finding them. But the officer started making calls to his colleagues on his mobile, tracing our route back down the road. I must admit, I thought all that was just for show. But a few days later, to my absolute astonishment, this officer said he had located my glasses on the battlefield where I'd leant down to count the Al-Shabaab bullets. My glasses then made a circuitous journey home. They travelled first in an armoured personnel carrier heading for the Ugandan military headquarters in the Somali capital Mogadishu, and they weren't broken when this vehicle was hit by another roadside bomb. Then they were taken in another armoured car from the Ugandan military base to the Somali president's office, where a friend of mine works. He happened to be due to travel to the UK. Then there was a quick hop from Mogadishu to Nairobi, a rather longer flight to London, and my glasses were finally returned to me. My friend handed them over here at BBC Broadcasting House. They were slightly bent, but nothing a little twisting couldn't resolve. My journey with the African Union forces has put a number of things into sharper focus. The first is that this is a terrible, widespread war. But Somalia is not just a war zone. Parts of it are very, very beautiful. And finally, if you ever lose your glasses on a battlefield, all I can say is, never lose sight of hope.